Mr. Ambassador, do you remember or recollect any of the circumstances surrounding your appointment as ambassador to Vietnam?
Yes, I do remember them quite well, as a matter of fact. My first wife died in 1964, and my present wife and I were married in Kathmandu, January 3rd, 1967. We just went back to celebrate our anniversary. And I was then ambassador at large and had been working on the desalinization problem in the Middle East. And I had to go from Nepal to Buenos Aires to head our delegation to the Foreign Ministers Organization of American States meeting. Secretary Rusk had to return to Washington and asked me to take over. And I got a message there saying that he'd like to see me as soon as I returned. I got back on a weekend, I remember. This was the end of February, I think, and he said, "The president wants to see you. He's in Texas now, but he'll be back Tuesday morning, and he'd like to see you then." So I went to see the president, and he said, "I want you to go to Vietnam. It's the most important problem we have in our foreign relations today, and I'd like you to take that on." "Well," I said, "Mr. President, I've just been married. You just appointed me ambassador at large. I certainly have got to consult my wife, who was in Kathmandu." He said, "That's right. You must do that. I'll give you a plane. You go out to Kathmandu and you see Carol and then meet me in Guam." And so I went out I sent word to my wife that I could only stay for 3 days, and so I got off the plane. She said, "I know the answer." So I went on to Guam.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the president had a meeting with the Vietnamese, and Cabot Lodge was then ambassador there. He was there, and General Westmoreland, who was then commander, was there, and we had a conference there with Thieu and Key and the other Vietnamese. But I certainly hadn't expected to go to Vietnam, and I actually spent more than 6 years there before I got through. The president said, I'm going to give you a plane. I want you to go up and see Carol every month." I had the plane, but I didn't get up every month. But I usually did send the plane up to Kathmandu, and she came down to Saigon. But it happened to be a very popular route, flying route, because we had about 30 extra seats, I guess, and so there was a long waiting line for people to go on R&R to Kathmandu.
Mr. Ambassador, how did you go about acquiring the kind of background that would be necessary to a post like that? Did you go through briefings, read books, articles? Was there anything that specifically informed the perspective that you would have when you got there?
Yes. I had, as a matter of fact, the president sent with me 2 people when I went out to Kathmandu to see my wife. He sent with me 2 people. Bill Jordan was one of them, and I've forgotten who the other one was, to brief me on the situation in Vietnam. Bill Jordan was then with the National Security Council, and so they briefed me on the way out to Kathmandu and on the way out to Guam, and I had reports to read too, documents to read. But I didn't have much time. The president was very impatient, and he was very anxious to get me there as quickly as possible. And this must have been in March, and I got there in April. I got there, actually, Cabot left in the morning, and I got there in the afternoon. And usually, you know, there's a space between ambassadors taking over. And but the president was very insistent that I get there right away, so I went right on.
Did you feel when you got there that, aside from these briefings and what you'd read about in the press and so forth, that there was no time to acquire the kind of understanding of how or why we had gotten involved in Vietnam over the years, and that posed any difficulty?
Well, that's quite true. I didn't have time to go into the history or any long history other than what was generally known, I mean, about why we had gotten involved and so forth. I mean, I thought about it, of course, but I had no briefings on that early, much on the, except from the fact of our going in there and taking an interest in the situation, as we did in the Kennedy administration. I've thought since, of course, about about the reasons for our involvement, and it seems to me that the atmosphere at the time rather made that sort of made it inevitable in a way. You remember Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "We will accept any risk and assume any burden in defense of liberty." And I think that was the spirit of the times. I think Kennedy represented the spirit of the times, which have changed radically now, of course. The public doesn't feel that, the country doesn't feel that way anymore. But I think that given the situation that existed, and I wonder if the same situation existed today, whether we wouldn't have repeated the same thing. But it doesn't. It's radically changed by the war. But I think that the principle of self-determination, for example, runs through our whole history, like a thread through the whole history of our foreign policy for 200 years, the right of self-determination, thing that basis on which our country got its independence. And this was what we were trying to defend in Vietnam, the right of the people to determine under what kind of government they wanted to live. I remember going up for questioning for the Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Fulbright saying to me, suppose there was a vote in South Vietnam and the vote turned out to be communist, would we agree to that? I said yes, if that's what the people want. We're there because of our, well, obligations in the United Nations also to resist aggression, but and under the SEATO Treaty. But that's a principle, I think, that we would stand by. But they never had a chance to make that determination, unfortunately.
One of the problems, as I recall, of holding elections in Vietnam was that the party in power tended to win the election.
Well,
and that always posed a problem for determining who was trying to determine.
Well, it's not entirely true. In the first elections we had in 1967, right, there were 11 candidates. Chu and Key got the plurality. They got about 35% of the vote. But there were 11 other candidates at the time. In the 4 years later, both Key and General Min, Big Min, announced themselves as candidates. And it's interesting, we carried out in the provinces, through our advisors there, an informal poll. We didn't do it ourselves, but I mean, for the Vietnamese. The polls came out about 50% in favor of the Chu Key ticket, about 20% of the not Chu Key, but Chu Tran Van Hong ticket. Key had about 20%, Big Min 20%. But both of them withdrew. I mean, they realized they couldn't have been elected, and rather than lose face, they pulled out. So there wasn't the opposition that we had expected or hoped that there might be at the time of the elections. But I think it was clear at the time that Chu did have, certainly 50% of the people supported him, and the other two. But there was no indication of wasn't any communist candidate in the picture.
Would you believe then that throughout the 6 years of your tenure as ambassador, that the government probably accurately reflected the will of the people of South Vietnam?
The majority of the people, yes, I think so. I think the majority of the people, obviously, strongly anti-communist. Well, as you recollect, practically 1 million of them had left North Vietnam because of communism.
Mainly Catholics, of course.
Catholic element, but that's a substantial part of the population. And I think there's no question in my mind that the country was strongly anti-communist, preponderantly so. You had the Viet Cong, of course, who were largely underground and who did represent the communist viewpoint. But I think the great majority of the people were certainly anti-communist. At the same time, there was among them, I think, too, among all Vietnamese, North or South, wanted to see the country united. They felt Vietnamese nationalism very strongly, but they didn't want to live, most of the people in the South didn't want to live under a communist government, although they did want to see the country united at the same time.
When you went to Vietnam, other than the understanding that you had of the situation in Vietnam, were there any other beliefs or preconceptions about international politics, whether they be about a bipolar world or the domino theory, that you had that you can recall as being influential in the way you thought about the problem?
Well, when I went to, I would say in '67, we were in a sort of a transition period from the bipolar world to the multilateral situation that we're in today. Although still, there are still, this element still exists, but the Cold War was sort of dwindling at the time, becoming not quite as cold a war as it had been 10 or 15 years earlier, right after the Second War. But still, we had, as you recall, these various alliances, beginning with NATO and CENTO and CETO and others, which were largely designed to protect what we considered the free world against the encroachment of communism, and to enable our friends, our allies, to protect their interests and to protect their viewpoints. And so I think the feeling was stronger. Then, of course, with the Nixon administration came détente, the opening to China, and the world picture began to change. And what we hoped would be an easier situation hasn't proved to be so easy in recent years, but nevertheless, there was a tendency, I think, to see a change in the world picture scene and the question of interdependence, multilateral diplomacy became much more to the fore. For example, I think in 1950 there were some 60 members of the United Nations, starting out in the beginning with 50. I was a delegate to the 11th Assembly. There were 81 members then. There are 149 today. Maybe 150 by now as I'm sitting here. Yeah. So that there's been a great change in the field of not only foreign relations, economic relations, the whole area of diplomacy.
Just out of curiosity, I can remember back in the late 60s and early 70s that some people would say, if we were to get out of Vietnam, that ultimately Indochina would become a bone of contention between the Chinese and the Russians. And the idea wasn't very widely held at the time. However, more recently, events have suggested that in fact, may be the case. Do you recall at all at that time having heard that thesis and your reaction to it?
No, I hadn't. I hadn't heard it at all. in that context, that is, that if we got out of Vietnam, that the Chinese and the Russians would be contenders. But I hadn't heard it. As a matter of fact, of course, when I was in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese were being supported both by the Soviets and the Chinese, and there was some rivalry between them as to the extent of their assistance and aid, as you recall.
The argument was that our presence there perpetuated the alliance, in a sense.
Yes, I know, but I didn't hear that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that had anything to do with it or not. My impression is that whether we were there or not, this probably would have come about because of both considering themselves Asiatic powers, that there would have been contention anyway between them for influence in that part of the world, both in North and South Asia, Korea as well as South Asia, Southeast Asia.
In looking at the problem now with this, 5, 8 years in retrospect now, is there any knowledge or insight that you've since acquired that you think during the period when you were ambassador, had you known it, might have changed your attitude towards the problem, or do you think that you pretty much would have done what you did given what you knew?
Oh, I don't know. I think given what I knew at the time, I think my attitude would have been the same. My view still is there. We went in there with honorable reasons and with reasons that had guided our policy as principles. We went in on principle, not to gain anything. We didn't want to acquire any territory. We went in on the basis of what I think of what Kennedy propounded as a philosophy to the American people, and I think was accepted at the time by the people. As events turned out, I think as the situation turned out, I mean, obviously, I hope we've learned a good many lessons from Vietnam. But one of them is that I think a democracy can't wage war successfully unless it has a consensus of support behind it. Wilson knew that in 1918, the War of 1918. Roosevelt knew it in the Second World War. You remember that Wilson, I think, was elected on the slogan of being too proud to fight. But he realized eventually that our interests would involve us in the war, but couldn't move into it until the public opinion, he had brought it along to the point where it would accept war. The same thing was true with Roosevelt. He knew before we got into the war that we would be in the war. But it took a long time to bring the public along to that viewpoint. The basis for destroyers deal was one of the things. Mm-hmm. Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies was another thing, which I worked in myself. Till that point came when there was public support for our position in the war, and then we fought it successfully. In Vietnam, there never was that. I think it was in the beginning, in the first place, there was never a declaration of war. When we got in at Kennedy's time, I think on a misjudgment, a lack of knowledge of the situation. We thought we were going in there with advice to the Vietnamese, and as we had advisors in Greece and Turkey and Korea, we fought a limited war in Korea. And I think when we first went in, we didn't even think of it fighting any kind of war, but giving advice. Then when we found that the situation, South Vietnamese probably would not be able to handle it, we did go in. And I think we went in, when we went in the beginning, on a misjudgment of the nature of the war. The war was new to the American experience. We had never fought a war like that before. It was both a guerrilla war and a conventional war. It was a war in which the enemy had sanctuaries to which he could retreat, refit, reinforce, come back. It was a political war and a psychological war. And we, I think, had never fought a war like that before. Didn't know how to fight it. But again, I think made another misjudgment when we did send in troops. I think then we believed, I think our military believed, we could finish up the job ourselves. We didn't begin to train the Vietnamese nearly as soon as we should have. We didn't really begin to train them intensively until I got there. And General Abrams came out as deputy to Westmoreland, and his job was to really train the Vietnamese. So that they were not in a position to take over really until 72, 73. And in the meantime, we had put in a tremendous number of troops. And, well, we had some 550,000 men there. Half of them were not combat troops, so they were support and supply, but had a great many troops there by that time. Because, I say, we hadn't understood the nature of the war, and we hadn't understood the nature of our opponents.
Mr. Ambassador, one of the problems of an ambassador, of course, is to really understand what's happening in a particular country and to be reliably informed about it. This has perhaps been most recently evidenced by events in Iran, where the ambassador there has been subject to serious criticism. And I was just curious as to the extent to which you believed you were able to really understand what was happening in Vietnam, given the situation there, the fact that the military had control over certain parts of the areas, and perhaps your accessibility was limited. To what extent do you believe you really understood the situation there, or it was even possible for you to understand it?
It's hard for me to answer that. What I can say is that I think that I had an outstanding organization in Vietnam. First place, I think the department took pains to see that we got the top people there in Vietnam, go all the way down through the younger grades as ranks as well as the upper ranks. They were a tremendous group, I think. These young people serving out in the country under great danger all the time and serving well, and I think did an outstanding job. And the same thing is true of the military. My relations with the military, I consider, couldn't have been better. With General Westmoreland, and especially with General Abrams, his successor, who was one of the ablest men I've ever met, really a great individual. And they never did any action without consulting me. Never took any action or any step or any move without letting me know about it or consulting with me. Now, we had, as you know, from your experience there, we had our advisors, the department had its advisors, serving with the military concurrently in all the provinces, in all the areas where they were serving. And we had the closest kind of relationship now. And we had also a great number of particularly among the people serving in the field, and among the younger people, Vietnamese-speaking people. Some of them there for much longer than the normal 2 terms, some of them coming back again, extending their periods, and getting and making it a point to get in close contact with the Vietnamese themselves. And I think, and this is something we made a special effort to do, to try to understand the Vietnamese and to try to understand what motivated them. And I think more than in any other post I've been in, because we were in this situation. We were in a difficult spot. And as I was saying, I don't know that one can ever fully understand what motivates another people, particularly another culture, as in Asia. But I think that we had the means, and attempted to provide the means to get as clear an understanding of the Vietnamese as was possible, as I have seen in any other mission, or more so than any other mission I've served, because the stakes obviously were high, and it's very important to do so. But I had the greatest admiration for them, particularly in Tet 68. When we were all under fire, attacked one place or another, my own house, the response right down to the lowest grade and out into the country everywhere was simply magnificent.
Do you think Hanoi's objective during the Tet Offensive was a military objective in Vietnam, or do you think it was directed at the United States through the media?
I think both. I think they thought that they could achieve a military victory and hoped it would have a psychological effect. They did not achieve a military victory. It was a substantial military defeat for Hanoi, but they did achieve a psychological victory in the United States. And that was a turning point, certainly in public opinion, because of the way it was presented by the press. A very interesting study of that has been made by Peter Braestrup and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. The press reporting, you're familiar with that, it's a huge work, 900 pages or something, but of the reporting of the Tet Offensive and how it affected American public opinion, and what was a military defeat, because not only were they put out of every place they got into, but the Viet Cong was practically destroyed. They all surfaced at the time, and most of them killed. They'd been working undercover. They all thought, this is the great day, and we'll come out now. And they came out and were killed, most of them. So that was, as I say, it's interesting, I think. One has to remember, this was the first war fought without any press censorship. It was the first war fought on television. Came into everybody's living room. And the horrors of warfare were depicted in the living room, but mostly horrors, much of them things committed by our side because they didn't get to the other side. So I think it gave the public a generally distorted view of the war itself, and tended to turn opinion against it. Now, that isn't true of all the reporting. I think we had some reporters who reported the war very accurately and fairly. I think, for instance, Joe Alsop told it like it was, as he said, and Kaz Beach of Times, Fox Butterfield of the New York Times, and Bob Kaiser in the Washington Post, and others. But there were others who I think gave a very distorted view of the situation. So, but I think one lesson to come out of the war is the fact that to attempt to fight a limited war with limited objectives, by inference limited in time, and with limited resources, against an enemy whose objectives are unlimited, who has the means, or is given the means, to wage unrestricted warfare, is not a viable policy. The Americans are impatient people. they're not used to long wars. Never have fought long wars except this one. As I say, by inference, I think the wars felt limited in time. Korea was a different situation because there was the United Nations involved, and we had allies, and we had the influence of world opinion, the United Nations on our side, and it was a relatively short war. So, but this was a new situation, and I think one of the lessons to come out of it is that if you're going to engage in war, you have to make up your mind you're going to win it.
Do you recall, I was thinking of the Tet Offensive, your reaction at the time, about the same period, to McCarthy's candidacy and the primary in New Hampshire and Kennedy's subsequent decision that he would run? Do you recall at all what your reflections on that were in this sort of bitter time?
McCarthy in New Hampshire?
Right. I think it was maybe, what, February '68?
February '68, I guess. I was pretty much involved with the Tet '68 was, I think, January 31st, wasn't it? And we were pretty well tied up. I don't recall very much, except I know that McCarthy was obviously against the war, and I wasn't willing to accept that position. But
I guess what I was thinking of is that, in a sense, it was a reflection of the domestic concerns that Johnson had to have, President Johnson. And I was curious as to how those concerns might have reflected on you, in the sense that perhaps President Johnson, as he subsequently said, was mainly concerned that what would happen in Vietnam, were the United States to gradually withdraw, would lead to a kind of a lobby, as occurred after the so-called loss of China in the late 40s. And he was worried that the kind of dissension that perhaps McCarthy represented would undermine his policies. And so I was wondering how, when you were in Vietnam, you reacted to all the turmoil that was taking place in the United States.
Of course, we were a long way from it. And so preoccupied with what we were doing that I don't think we had really much opportunity to give a great deal of thought to it, except we were disturbed by it, naturally. And but, you know, another thing I think about the war was the fact that the way we got into it made it a difficult war to fight. We got in gradually because, I think, of a misjudgment in the very beginning, and I don't blame anyone for it, because I say the war was new to the American experience, but that the feeling on the part of our military that they could do the job and get it cleaned up and get out, and it turned out to be wrong, as they admitted themselves. And it turned out to be a much, much, much longer war, and I think that the president, one criticism I would have of President Johnson was that he didn't bring the public enough into his confidence on the reasons for our being there and why we were there and why we had to send troops there, because instead we kept increasing our forces there gradually, but I mean, the question of guns and butter, having both at the same time, and going on with the increasing our forces, the public never was given an adequate explanation or a full enough explanation of why the issues there were important to us. The principles involved were important to us. I don't think enough. If you look over the records, you don't find a great many speeches by President Johnson on the Vietnam War. And then, of course, when Nixon came in, and when I went there, I mean, my mission was to try to wind the war up, wind it down, and try to get the Vietnamese to take over.
Did you believe seriously in the whole Vietnamization policy?
Yes, I did, and I think when at the time of the Paris agreements in '73, January '73, and I left on May 11, '73, I think if we had carried out subsequently the commitments that President Nixon made to Thieu, we might have had a different story. Congress, by July or August of '73, made it impossible to carry out those commitments. I gave Thieu personally 3 letters from the President in which he made a commitment to us to come to their assistance in case of any major violation of the treaties by the other side. By July or August, Congress made it impossible, refused to appropriate money. The result was, in the last 15 months, up to the time of the collapse, all we were able to supply was ammunition and medicine. The Paris agreements provided that each side could replace equipment used up, destroyed, worn out on a one-for-one basis. We never did it. The Russians and the Chinese did it consistently to the North Vietnamese. What was the result? The result was that every day that went by, the South Vietnamese had less and less to fight with. How could they have defended themselves? It's impossible.
Over the course of the war, didn't we give them, in fact, many more supplies, much more ammunition than the North ever got from Russia or China?
I don't believe so. We may have given them more heavy weapons and that sort of thing, but the fact is that the Russians and the Soviets and the Chinese supplied the other side very well for what they needed, for the kind of warfare to carry on, and kind of warfare that was waged there. They were very well equipped, and when the situation which finally developed in the South Vietnamese, when every day you have fewer planes or fewer tanks or fewer weapons, what does it do to your morale? Or how do you fight? Well, no matter how good your morale is, against an enemy that's just completely supplied. Doesn't make any sense.
Another question
I think really it was a betrayal of the South Vietnamese. They were led to, if Thieu had these letters of commitment, which I gave to him personally, now, the Vietnamese, I think, were very well equipped at the time of the Paris Agreement. The 1972 offensive was turned back by the Vietnamese, not by us. We had no troops there. Vietnamese fought the '72 offensive and defeated the North.
In looking at the policies of the Nixon administration, the first Nixon administration, I think the Americans lost something like 20,000 dead in Vietnam, if you count non-combat deaths as well as combat deaths. And in retrospect, looking at the policies that we followed, maybe this is a question that's difficult to answer because of the policies that you were looking at, as you were just talking, between '72 and '73. But do you think it was worth the loss of those lives, our policy, gradual withdrawal?
Well, it depends on your view of the war, or what we were involved in and why. I mean, if we'd made a sudden withdrawal, obviously, the Vietnamese couldn't have withstood the Hanoi. They weren't trained enough. They weren't experienced enough. If we had withdrawn in well, say '69, the early days of the administration, I don't think we would have given them a fair chance. What Nixon wanted to do and Kissinger wanted to do was to withdraw as rapidly as we could, but try to ensure that the Vietnamese would be able to defend themselves. That's one of the purposes we were there. And we did start withdrawing the troops, as you remember, in the summer of '69, after the meeting that Chiu and Nixon had on Guam. And we kept on gradually withdrawing them as we felt the Vietnamese were able to take over. And my view is that, and certainly was the view of General Abrams and General Wyand, who succeeded him as commander, that they would be able to do that when we withdrew. We withdrew the last of our troops there before the offensive of '72.
In assessing your own performance in 6 years in Vietnam, and as you think back on it, what would you take to be your greatest personal accomplishment, and if you were to judge yourself harshly, perhaps your greatest failure in 6 years?
I think perhaps I might think that perhaps my major accomplishment was in winning the confidence of the Vietnamese, of the government, not only Chiu, but I think the government generally. I think they had confidence in my integrity and trustworthiness. And consequently, I think I had more influence with Chiu and with the government in South Vietnam than I certainly otherwise would have had. I think perhaps more influence than on the record than any other ambassador who had been there. I mean, it may be a good deal to say, but I think that, and perhaps because I was there longer, others who served before me served a much briefer period of time, and I had time to win their confidence. So I don't say it was any great achievement, but I think it was, I consider it perhaps the most important. And secondly, and perhaps almost as important, is my relations with the military. With General Westmoreland, when he was first command, he left in '68. General Abrams, who followed him, and General Wyand, who followed General Abrams. But they made it very clear to their own organizations that no action was to be taken before I was informed of it. And that was true, and they followed out to the letter, so that we had a very close working relationship. As to the greatest failure, well, I think, of course, the great tragedy of the whole thing was the whole failure of the war, and I mean, my effort, which was a part of it, wasn't sufficient to carry through. I think another thing that I didn't succeed in was in urging the Vietnamese, or being sufficiently forceful in urging them to Chiu and Key to stay in the race and to stay, demonstrate that this was, they had to take their chances in any democratic system, and this was what they presumably were fighting for. And I think that was certainly a disappointment to me, to see the elections of '71 turn out as only one candidate. But as the president said at the time, President Nixon said you can't compel people to run if they don't want to. But nevertheless, I did hope that we would demonstrate, again, as I think they demonstrated in the '67 elections, when they had so many candidates, that people had a chance to express themselves between a choice of candidates.
In reflecting on the experience in Vietnam, not just under your tenure, but the whole experience,
yeah,
and in trying to explain it, which is what historians always try to do, how do you come up with some kind of measure of accountability for public officials, not just diplomats and military people, but people in the government, the Congress, and so forth. Do you, in your own mind, have any assessment that you would make of that, or would you simply think that this was a very difficult problem that many people tried to work on and it didn't work out?
I'm not sure that I'm quite clear about the question. I think the many factors that entered into that situation. For example, take the attitude of students toward the war, where all these problems came in 68, 69, demonstrations and so forth. Kaz Beach, who was a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times, came back, I think, the summer of 68, and went around and tried to appraise and account for the attitude of students toward the war. He came back with a very interesting observation. He said, I think a lot of this agitation against the war, feeling against the war, is a problem of conscience. He said, I think those people, the students who have been deferred because they're at universities learning, see the war being fought by those less fortunate than they are, by the less privileged class, and that their consciences trouble them. And this is one element in the attitude of the students toward the war. I think it's a very interesting observation.
When you reflect now on the principles that were involved, and I'm thinking of President Johnson, President Nixon, the various secretaries that you work with, would you care now to think about those individuals and characterize your relationships with them, and perhaps briefly assess, from your opinion, their performances, any of the ones that happen to leap out in your own mind?
Oh, I don't know. That's a big order for and would require considerable thought on my part. I've served 7 presidents, so that I don't know whether you want me to go through each of them, but
I was thinking mainly of President Johnson and President Nixon and the staffs under them, because you essentially dealt with them on the Vietnam issue.
Yes, I dealt with President Johnson very closely, beginning with the Dominican crisis. And then, I think because of that, he asked me to go to Vietnam, really, because of the way we handled the Dominican situation. And I liked President Johnson, admired him very much, and I thought he was extremely able, and particularly in his dealings with the Congress. I think he got more civil rights legislation through the Congress than any president, or all the rest of them put together, because he was a master at handling the Congress, and what was one of his great strengths as president, why he gets things. Certainly, if it hadn't been for the Vietnam War, I think he would have had a very different appraisal. There would have been a very different appraisal of President Johnson. I think in the light of history, he'll have a much better place than he has at the moment, or that he had when he retired. Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State during all that time, I also admired very much, and my relations with him couldn't have been, from my point of view, better. I had constant, steadfast support from him on everything that I did. And the same thing held for Mr. Nixon. I found Mr. Nixon very intellectually quite unusual in his grasp of details and of situation. When I would come back on consultation, I would find him very well informed, and not only well informed, but also able to express his views very cogently. And Kissinger, I had the greatest admiration for his ability and his grasp of problems. He of course, carried on the negotiations with Les Doctaux in Paris, as you know, and brought them to a successful conclusion. It wasn't possible to do it in the Paris Peace Conference. It really wasn't. The Paris Peace Conference wasn't a peace conference. It was an exercise in propaganda on both sides. Nothing was ever decided at the Paris Conference. Kissinger's secret negotiations with Les Doctaux that worked out the framework for the Paris agreements. It wasn't done through open diplomacy. So that no, he's very able. And of course, I left Vietnam in May '73, and didn't keep in touch with it after that because I was then chief negotiator for the Panama Canal treaties and completely absorbed in that situation.
Were there any people that you had serious disagreements with within the bureaucracy? I'm thinking ones that surfaced were people like George Ball or possibly Clark Clifford at a given time, maybe Averell Harriman. Were there any people that you sort of opposed bureaucratically that might give us some insight into understanding how the process worked?
Well, I had very little of that. I did disagree with Clark Clifford in, I guess it was June '68. Came over prior to a meeting we were to have in Honolulu with the president, and Clark Clifford then was an advocate of a rapid pullout. I disagreed with him. I said I thought the whole situation would collapse if we pulled out then. Well, we went to Honolulu and had a meeting there with the president and his other advisors, military as well, and the president agreed with my position at the time that we should negotiate, try to get them to negotiate to the negotiating table, that we were not then in a position to pull out our forces without bringing about a collapse of the regime. But otherwise, no, I can't think of any particular disagreements that I had on matters of policy.
In thinking about the lessons of Vietnam, Ernest May at Harvard has written a little book on the lessons of history, and in it he comes to the conclusion that many policymakers use history, they also use it badly, and that they could use it a lot better. And clearly in recent years, people have talked a lot about the lessons of Vietnam. They've said in Africa, for example, that Vietnam has told us such and such, and therefore we should have such and such a policy. You've already mentioned several cases of what you think to be lessons.
Yes.
But in looking at the whole broad experience, and now in retrospect, what do you think Vietnam can really teach us about American policy, and what kinds of conclusions should we draw from our experience there?
Well, one is, I suppose, that we ought not to fight a land war in Asia. But I think the strongest things that come out of it, one of the strongest things is that a democracy can't fight a war successfully unless people are behind it. They were behind the war, World War I, they were behind World War II, and they went along on Korea because we had a lot of companions in it with us, and the United Nations was supporting us. We had other contingents fighting with us, and some very good, tough ones. And it didn't last long. But Americans are impatient people. They don't envisage long wars. And I think the general feeling is that if you're going to go to war, you better make up your mind to win it. In a limited war, you tie your own hands. For instance, well, give you one example, and this is one point of failure on my part. In June 1967, I sent a personal message to the president with General Westmoreland's backing, suggesting that we go into Laos and cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail on the ground that it would stop the infiltration of personnel and of supplies. If they were cut off, the Viet Cong would wither on the vine. They had the only way they could carry on any hostilities was being supplied, both with men and equipment. The North. I was turned down, obviously, because we didn't do it, for three reasons. First, that it would be a violation of the 1962 agreements on Laos. And I said, that's quite true. But the other side never observed the agreement from the day they signed it. They've been violating Laotian neutrality, sending men down through Laos and equipment through Laos. Secondly, they were concerned about the Chinese. Maybe this might be some excuse for them to get into the situation. I said, well, I think, it seems to me we have plenty of friends in Peking. The British are there, the French are there, many of our friends. We can make it very clear to the Chinese we have no designs on China or on North Vietnam. We don't want to influence the government in North Vietnam. They have any kind of government they want to, but they're not going to take over the South, that's all. We're resisting aggression. Third was that it would take a couple of more divisions, which is true, but we put them in anyway before we got through. Well, we didn't do it. I mean, that was one thing we didn't do. We didn't attempt to mine Haiphong, so that we did, say, tie our own hands to a great extent in what we were doing.
Do you think the failure to achieve a domestic consensus behind the war was a function of draft policy, which led to college students with guilty consciences? In other words, might the president, by changing the draft policy, have changed the domestic consensus?
Well, I don't think any one thing would have changed it. I think that might have helped to change it, but. As I say, I think one criticism I have of President Johnson is that I don't think he explained fully enough or often enough to the people why we were doing what we were doing, why he was sending troops out there.
Do you think he understood clearly?
I think he did, yes. I think he did. But again, it may have been, as I say, this war was new to the American experience. Our military didn't know how to fight this kind of war when they started it, and they thought they could finish it up more quickly than they could. But they discovered that they couldn't do it alone, and that they had to, and if we were ever going to get out, that we had to train the Vietnamese, and that they had to be able to take over themselves. And certainly that was my objective and General Abrams' objective, who was one of our great commanders in my view, and a great individual. I just want to say a word about him. I think he was an extraordinary person, extraordinarily able, and had the proper concept of how to train the Vietnamese, how to end up the war, and my personal contacts with him couldn't have been better. We had one amusing incident. My bunker originally was, in the time of Tet 68, was the wine closet, which was sandbagged. And then they decided I ought to have a better bunker, so they built me a bunker there at the house. Well, the only other time I had to use it was when Secretary Laird came out early in the administration, and we were sitting in the library after midnight, and the shooting started, and Marines came and said, "Mr. Ambassador, I think you better get in the bunker." So I went down there, and we had all kinds of sophisticated equipment. And Mel Laird said he'd like to get in touch with General Wheeler, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, staying with General Abrams. I tried to get a connection, couldn't get any answer, couldn't get any connection with all this sophisticated equipment. And I said to General Abrams the next day, Abe, the secretary wanted to get in touch with General Wheeler, and we couldn't get you last night. He said, I'm sorry, I know, Ellsworth, my telephone was out of order. So with all the sophisticated equipment we had, it didn't work. One episode I remember was when we were trying to get the Vietnamese to go to Paris for the talks, and you know, they had a question of recognizing the Viet Cong came up, and the question of the table became a crucial issue, the shape of the table. Trying to work it out because they refused to put the Viet Cong on a level with the other participants. The other side insisted that they were on a level and were equally one of the four participants. We finally got it worked out. We had a four-sided table, but we cut the table in two, so there was a little space. And the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong sat on one side and we sat on the end. We always considered it a two-sided table, and we let them consider it a four-sided table. So both sides were satisfied.